Good evening, everyone. This week's Parsha is Parsha's Achrei Mot-Kedoshim, Tavshin Pei Aleph. I dedicate tonight's class in memory of my mother, Mr. Shlomis Rabinowitz, Shlomis Bas, Rav Yaakov Eliezer. So we're going to focus right now on the last verse, the last pasuk of Parsha's Achrei Mos, which is the first of the two Parshas of the Shabbos. And that the last verse reads, Ushmartem es mishmarti. Literally translated means you shall guard my guarding. Excuse me. So as not to do from the abominable practices that were done before you. You shall not contaminate yourselves through them. I am Hashem your God. So until now, the discussion of the parsha was arayos, which refers to the forbidden relatives, the relatives that and people, what is forbidden to have marital relations with. And then the Torah concludes, "You shall guard my guarding," which would be explained to mean that we have to guard or safeguard what the Torah tells us. The Torah prohibits us from marrying these people, and we have to keep to that. We have to guard that charge not to marry them. And that's what the Torah is referring to when it says, Ushmartem es mishmarti, you shall guard my guarding. I have told you to guard, to hold back from certain prohibitions for certain things that I prohibit to you, and you shall keep that. The Talmud actually derives from these words, Ushmartem es mishmarti, which is a repetitive phrase, that actually the Torah is teaching us something very basic and something that is very, very relevant to Judaism. And that is, Ushmartem means you should guard my guarding. I want you to guard. There are certain guards that I have put up in the Torah. Guard yourself from these prohibitions. And you make a guard to the guard. That means create a precautionary measure to make sure that you guard yourself from what you have to guard yourself from. Add another layer of guarding to the guarding that the Torah wants. The Torah says, don't marry these women, or don't whatever the Torah tells us not to do. And then the Torah says, make another level of guarding. Create extra precautionary measures so that you don't come to transgress that which the Torah told you to guard from. So that you don't accidentally come to transgress, or that you don't come to actually be tempted to transgress. And this is the basis for what we call Gezeres D'Rabbanan, rabbinic decrees. That the rabbis instituted prohibitions on top of what the Torah had prohibited as a safeguard, as a precautionary measure. So, for instance, the Torah prohibits us to move an object on Shabbos that its primary function is for something that you may not do on Shabbos. By not being able to move that object, that is excuse me, that's a protection not to actually perform the prohibition. Sure, don't, excuse me, the Torah says don't do a certain act that's prohibited on Shabbos. And the sages added an extra layer so as not to come to that. There are one of the prohibitions on Shabbos is that we're not permitted to trap animals. According to Torah law, animals that are typically trapped is what the Torah forbids from trapping. Animals that are not typically trapped, there is no prohibition to trap. But the sages made a decree to say all animals are forbidden to trap. Understandably, because if you're allowed to trap certain animals, you may come to trap all animals. And therefore, the sages instituted an extra layer of prohibition, an extra layer of safeguarding, so as not to come to transgress. And that is derived from these words, Ushmartem es mishmarti, you shall guard my guarding. Add another layer of guarding to what you have to guard from. Now, what I just explained to you is pretty understandable, but unfortunately, there are attitudes out there about rabbinic law and rabbinic decrees that the rabbis made Jewish observance just a lot harder. The Torah gives us enough restrictions. Is it really necessary to restrict us even more? We're being a little bit paranoid here, maybe, by some of the things we're concerned about. Well, think about the following, says Rabbi Zev Leff from Eretz Yisrael. Imagine there are a group of people at the top of a mountain, and they're right near a cliff that has a deep, deep drop. And somebody decides to put up a fence so that no one gets too close to the edge so as not to fall off. Is anybody going to complain and say, hey, why are you restricting our ability to move around? Or, hey, I wanted to look over and see what's over there. Why are you restricting me? But it's very understandable because it's very important to create a fence so that you don't accidentally fall over. It's not worth it. Whatever you think you're going to gain from not being restricted, if you land up falling off the cliff, not worth anything. If a person were to understand the severity of what it means to transgress a Torah prohibition, even unintentionally, we very well understood and appreciated that which our sages instituted, these fences, precautionary measures. We need to make, if we transgress, we have ruined ourselves. We've ruined our neshamas, our souls. We ruin our portion in the afterlife. We create a lot of very serious problems for ourselves when we sin. And therefore, if we understand that, then we appreciate how the sages decided when they felt it necessary, they instituted that, okay, we need to do something. We need to create precautionary measures so that people don't come to sin, because sinning is like falling off the cliff. Now, so we can understand and appreciate, why the sages did what they did. But at another level, the problem becomes when sometimes you get into some of the details of the rabbinic decrees, and they seem a little bit either far-fetched or beyond what's, they come across a bit far-fetched. Let me give you an example. Now, this example per se is not far-fetched at all. There is a rabbinic prohibition called yichud. Yichud means it is prohibited for a man and woman who are not married or closely related to be in private with each other, lest something happen. Now, that may not be very politically correct nowadays. And President Mike Pence, when he said that he doesn't, that if he meets with a woman, he has his wife nearby, was ridiculed. But the people ridiculing are the people who really don't care. They're the people who have too much trust in themselves or have too much of another agenda to worry about what happens. And everybody knows that in reality, things happen. Things, unfortunately, happen even amongst the most religious people if you're not careful. And therefore, yichud, the rabbis created a prohibition that a man and a woman who are not married and are not close relatives may not be in seclusion with each other. They may not be in alone. Now, there are certain, there's a lot of details to that, to the laws of this prohibition. But essentially, that's what it's about. And it's about to protect people from falling to their temptations. Okay, so that could be well understood. But Rabbi Leff brings the following example. The example was that one of his congregants one time asked him the following, that he had an old, sickly uncle who he wanted this uncle to move in with his two teenage daughters. His teenage daughters had an apartment, and he wanted that the old sickly uncle should move in with them, and they'll take care of him. And Rabbi Leff said, "It's a problem. It's a problem of yichud with the two great nieces. An uncle and a niece are permitted to each other, so it could be a problem." So the congregant couldn't believe it. He couldn't believe it. But what? You're worried about my old sickly uncle? You think he's going to do anything? That was his reaction. So what is the response to that? So from what I see in Rabbi Zev Leff's book, I would understand his answer the following way. And he starts with a story. There's a famous Rav in Eretz Yisrael, Rav Eliyahu Lapian Zatzal, who was the Meshkiach. He was a rabbi in a yeshiva, in a boys' yeshiva. And one of the boys asked him permission to attend a relative's wedding. So Rav Lapian asked him, will there be any people there that will be dressed immodestly? And the boy basically answered yes, but don't worry, Rebbe, he said. I'm beyond that. I've come to a point that these things don't bother me. So Rabbi told him, okay, but before you go to the wedding, I want you to call up a friend of mine. And he gave him a number. The boy went, called up, came back and said, Rebbe, this must have been a mistake. You gave me a phone number for a doctor. So Rabbi said to him, no, it's not a mistake. Rabbi said, I am in my late 80s. I'm blind in one eye. And these things, the amount of stress, bothers me. It can affect me. But you tell me it doesn't affect you. I think you need to go see a doctor. Now, the point of that story is that he's an old man. But he said it still affects him, still bothers him. Sometimes we tend to be a little bit too lax and easygoing about our weaknesses and temptations. And it's actually the divine wisdom of the sages, of these holy men who understood very well what the power of passion and temptation is. It can even affect an old man. And therefore, it was with that divine wisdom that they said, the prohibition of yichud, the prohibition of being in seclusion applies to everyone, because the power of passion and desire is that powerful. And we need our sages of old with their divine wisdom to really point out to us what we may be lax about. Now, I was thinking of this a little bit on a different, to answer this question on a little bit of a different approach. It's not very different, just a little bit different. Because again, if I understand correctly, he's saying, hey, even in an old man, something could happen. Yeah, listen, it could be tempted and try to do something. But I thought about it a little bit of a different approach. And the approach is, again, based on the same story we said before. You can have people who think, now this boy was a little bit of an extreme. But there are plenty of people who think, oh, it won't happen to me. I won't do that. I would never do that with this person. It's not a problem. If we give permission to those who maybe actually the problem isn't so much of a problem for them, like an old sick man. But if we allow even them, if we allow them to go ahead and if we relax the prohibition for them, then that's going to give an excuse. That's going to give a place for those who are fooling themselves to say, oh, I'm just like that. I don't have to be concerned. So therefore, the sages understood everybody has to be in the prohibition so that no one can find any kind of excuse to say it doesn't apply to me, because people will do that. Now, another example that Rebbe Lev gives about rabbinic prohibitions that also seems a bit extreme and far-fetched is the following. There is a prohibition that if a Gentile touches wine, we may not eat it anymore. We may not drink it anymore. If a Gentile cooks a food and a Jew didn't put on the fire, the Gentile put on the fire, cooked the food, even if you know the ingredients 100% kosher, the pot and pan was 100% kosher, he walked into your house, he was in your house, he put on the fire, he cooked the food, all your ingredients in your pots and pans, you may not eat it. It's called bishul akum. What a Gentile cooks is forbidden to eat. In restaurants, what they do is they make sure that the mashgiach turns on the fire. If a Jew turns on the fire, the non-Jew can do the rest of it. Now, what are the reasons for these prohibitions? It's to prevent intermarriage. Drinking wine, eating creates friendship, closeness, and if you start getting too close to the non-Jew, you may marry his daughter, you may marry your son to his daughter, whatever it may be. It's to prevent intermarriage. Now, it makes a lot of sense, such a prohibition, if you're sitting down and having a meal with the non-Jew. You go into his house and you sit down, and with taking away from all other issues of kosher, not kosher, you go ahead and you sit down with him, and you open up a kosher bottle of wine, he touches it, no good anymore. Okay, but I'm sorry, let's go back for a second. I understand if you're actually getting together with the non-Jew, that and eating and drinking together, that can create closeness and it can lead to intermarriage. But what if the case is that you're basically walking into the non-Jew was a waiter and he poured your wine, okay, and it wasn't what we call cooked wine. He poured your wine. You don't know how to drink it. What do you mean? You're going to marry his daughter? You don't even know who the guy. You don't know who the guy is. You have no connection with him. You go ahead and you went into a kosher restaurant, and what happened is that everything was good and kosher, but the non-Jew did everything. Put on the fire, cook the food. You can't eat it. Why? You're going to marry his daughter? You don't even know who he is. You have no connection with him. So what does it mean in these cases? Why did the sages forbid it even this far? It seems so far removed. It's not like the case before where it's actual yichud, it's actual being in private together. But for this person, it's not relevant because he can't do it. But here, it's like it's so far removed from the issue. Why did the sages go so far? So Relef explains, and this is explained by many commentaries, that some of the restrictions of sages is not about worrying about a specific case. The case of the yichud before, we can have a specific issue possibly, right? But when we talk about not eating the food that a non-Jew cooked or not drinking the wine that he made or touched, right? It's not about his daughter. It's not about them per se. It's about creating an atmosphere of separation between Jew and non-Jew. Food is something that brings people together. But even if it's not going to go ahead and specifically in this case bring you together with him, but by saying that no food from him, no wine from him, if we say that what he touched or what he made is forbidden to us, then we have created an absolute separation between Jew and non-Jew. And it's that atmosphere of separation that now will prevent intermarriage. It's not per se this act will bring to that. Not necessarily. But by doing this, by prohibiting this, we create an atmosphere, an attitude of separation. And that's what prevents intermarriage. And to give you an example, this is just an example of showing, when you prohibit extra things, it creates a certain attitude, a certain atmosphere. My brother told me this story a long time ago, and perhaps some of you heard this from me. Kedem grape juice is wine. And therefore, Kedem grape juice has to be made by observant Jews. And that's what happens when they do a run. They hire, Jewish people to make the grape juice, whatever that means exactly. But there are non-Jewish workers there. So one of the rules that was told to the non-Jewish workers at this plant was, you cannot press any buttons. No buttons. You don't press any buttons. That was in order to keep them, not by saying no buttons. That now keeps them away from getting near anything that could be considered producing the grape juice. Well, there was one Jewish man working there who at one point made some kind of mistake, and the wine started pouring out onto the floor. And what he had to do was press a button to shut off the machine, but he panicked, he didn't know what to do. So the non-Jewish workers that were there are screaming at him, press the button, press the button, press the button. But he panicked, he didn't know what to do. So they grabbed his hand and pressed the button with his hand. They wouldn't touch the button. They wouldn't touch it. So they took his hand and pushed his hand into the button to shut off the machine. That's because it created an atmosphere. I mean, if they would have shut off the machine, nothing would have been wrong. But it became so ingrained in them not to touch. You cannot touch any buttons, that they wouldn't touch a button. They wouldn't touch a button. That's called creating an atmosphere, creating an attitude. And that is what our sages did at certain levels of prohibitions, or by certain prohibitions. Some of them were more direct. Some of them were more direct to prevent a more direct issue. If you will A match is something that's primarily used for something that's forbidden on Shabbos. If you could carry a match, you may strike it. That's direct. But then there are other ones, like the examples we gave about what a non-Jew cooks or a non-Jew touching wine, that it's not about if I touch this, if I touch his wine, I will marry his daughter. That's not what it's about. It's about creating an atmosphere of separation. And with that atmosphere of separation, that gets us to our goal of not stumbling, of not giving into our temptations. So it's very important to understand what is going on with these rabbinic laws, which, again, have created more restrictions in our lives than the Torah itself would have put on. But the Torah mandated the sages that when they saw a need, that they should institute it. And we should appreciate that need because they're made to protect us. They're there to make sure we don't fall off the cliff. And even when they seem to be far-fetched, in their divine wisdom, they understood us for all generations more than we understand ourselves. When we're ready to fool ourselves and convince ourselves that it's not a problem, they told us, don't fool yourself. It's a problem. And when it was necessary to create an atmosphere to protect us from transgressing what the Torah prohibits, they created the atmosphere. It wasn't about, in that situation, it's not about preventing a direct problem from the act, a direct result from the act. But they understood that there's a necessity to protect the Torah by creating an atmosphere of separation. And therefore, even though it seems far-fetched, if we understand what it's about and we appreciate it, we appreciate what the sages did for us. They did it to protect us. They did it because they love us. It's the same thing if one time I saw an example of this. There's a child who, he gets very sick from sweets, right? So his father says, do not walk into that store. Because if he knows that the child walked to the store, he's going to buy the sweets and get sick. Don't walk into the store. The mother says, don't walk within a block of the store. Because the more you care, if you care about someone, you're going to go ahead and create precautionary measures. I can't even walk in within a block of the store. No, you can't. You can't. Because I love you and I care about you. And that is what the sages are doing for us. Not to restrict us, not to control the masses. But it was out of the love for the masses and to protect them that they created these restrictions. Have a wonderful evening.